Ani, hello. My name is Malcolm King. I'm a member and citizen of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation in Ontario. I'm a professor at the University of Saskatchewan and a member of the CanSolve CKD network team. Uh, Next slide, please. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the territory that I live and work on. It's Treaty 6 territory in Saskatoon. It's also the homeland of the Métis. I'd like everyone to acknowledge the territories on which of the first people where they are located. These connections with the land are important to all of us. Next slide, please. This is the first of three CanSolve CKD Indigenous research webinars. Our learning objectives for the three are here listed as look, listen, and learn. These are three important steps on the pathway to action and being able to do things in research. So today I'm going to deal with examining Indigenous worldviews and Indigenous research ethics principles. Next slide, please. Indigenous worldviews, you need to go back actually a slide, thank you. Indigenous worldviews are many because we're very diverse in our origins and views, but there are some commonalities that we find in the world of Indigenous ways of thinking. First and foremost, perhaps, is a critical bond to land and nature that seems to bring us all together. The territory and natural environment are reflected in our knowledge systems and social arrangements. We're part of and interconnected with our landscape. Our knowledges are experiential, observational, holistic, ecological, and systems-based. Kinship is really important. There's extensive kinship that includes the spirit realm. And time is viewed differently. It's cyclical and synchronical. Next slide. There are a couple of important concepts that I want to introduce at this point. One is the concept of ethical space. And this was described by Willie Ermine, a philosopher, an elder, a lodge keeper here in Saskatchewan at Sturgeon Lake First Nation. He talked about two groups getting together who come from different backgrounds and different purposes. One is a group representing the Western worldview, such as an academic institution, and the other being a group with an Indigenous worldview, such as a First Nation or an Inuit community or Métis. And when they get together, dialogue is necessary, engagement is necessary to achieve this kind of common ground where they can work together. And Willie has described this as ethical space. Next slide, please. Of course, part of the problem with achieving ethical space is that the playing field isn't level. The Western world has the majority of the resources and serves as has an advantage over the Indigenous world. And so part of our task in achieving ethical space that can lead to successful research is doing our best to level that playing field, to bring resources. And you can see this happening in the image. Next slide, please. The other important concept, and in some ways it looks a bit the same as the diagram that goes with ethical space, but it's referred to as two-eyed seeing. And this perspective was put forward by a number of people, but we're quoting Mi'kmaq elder Albert Marshall, who expounded on it in his views on how science could be blended with Western and Indigenous points of view. Elder Marshall talked about it as to see from one eye with the strengths of Western ways of knowing, and to see from the other eye with the strengths of Indigenous ways of knowing, and to use both of these eyes together. It's an image that depicts synergy of thought and action, bringing together the best of both worlds, both ways of knowing. Next slide, please. And finally, one more concept, and it really, in a way, relates to both of those, but particularly to ethical space, is something that came out in the early days of European colonization more than 400 years ago. In 1613, the Dutch settlers who came to what's now New York, it was New Amsterdam at the time, went up the Hudson River and met the Haudenosaunee, the Five Nations Confederacy, and in particular, the keepers of the Eastern Door, the Mohawks. And they conducted negotiations and came up with a treaty. The Dutch wrote their treaty down in the best Dutch. It was ultimately translated into English. But the Haudenosaunee had a different way of remembering treaties, and they used wampum belts, precious trade beads of purple and white. And the two rows of purple beads represented the canoes of the First Nation and the sailboats of the Europeans. And they symbolize traveling parallel down the river of life, never merging, never interfering with each other. And the white beads in between, representing things such as respect and peace, symbolize the relationships that were important between the two peoples who were very different. So it recognizes that Indigenous and Western approaches are distinct, yet equally significant. And we can learn from each other, which would fit then with the idea of two-eyed seeing. Next slide, please. So how do we bring Indigenous worldviews into research? One thing, and it's very important, is to recognize who the knowledge holders, the knowledge keepers are in our communities. They're the elders, the knowledge keepers, who are in essence the professors of our communities. The next thing is ceremony. Research needs to involve ceremony. It's about ceremony. And there's various kinds of ceremonies that are important, from smudging, purifying ceremonies, tobacco, recognizing the sacred plant from the creator that allows us to communicate and it allows our spirits to come out. Song and dance and drumming are important as expressions of ceremony, and feasting, sharing in that way. And finally, it's important to include wellness in research. Wellness is more than just the absence of disease. It's a balance in life that allows us to achieve what we need. Next slide, please. And it's important to remember that if you are dealing with dark issues, such as addiction, such as other kinds of things, diseases, you need to leave people with some light. And this was expressed by an elder with whom we work, Sharon Jinkerson Brass. Next slide, please. So our granting councils in Canada the Canadian Institutes of Health Research and the other two that deal with social sciences research and natural sciences have actually done a lot of work on ethical principles in health research. They've come out with a document called the TriCouncil policy statement, and it's in its second iteration now from 2010, and there have been some minor changes since then. It's a joint statement from these three research funding agencies that outlines ethical conduct for research involving humans. And there's 13 chapters altogether. Chapter 9 is the most relevant to what we're talking about today, research involving the First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples of Canada. Next slide, please. So there are 22 subsections of chapter 9. I'm not going to go through them all, but I'm going to, in this slide and the next two, deal with the ones that I think are most relevant to our talk. And I've bolded the items that I think are really the most important. And as I had mentioned earlier, the community engagement, that idea of bringing together different ways of thinking right at the beginning of the project. It's really important. So there is a requirement, ethical requirement for community engagement in Indigenous research, and this is laid out in the TriCouncil policy statement. We also need to respect our governing authorities, First Nations, Inuit, and Métis, and there's a diversity of these. We recognize diverse interests in general within communities, as well as between communities. And we respect community customs and codes of practice. We need to also respect our institutional processes, in the research ethics boards and their processes in our institutions. And to achieve all of this, good practice really involves coming to research agreements, negotiating them in advance of the research project. It's not only desirable, it's encouraged. Next slide, please. So here we have some more key concepts and principles. Collaborative research. Communities need to be full partners and active partners in research. This needs to happen really at all stages of the research, from the initial visioning and design of the project through the data collection and analysis, and ultimately to the application of the knowledge and the dissemination. There need to be mutual benefits in research, both for the communities and for the researchers, the academic community. Researchers need to bring some real benefits to the communities. It can't be just research for research's sake. There needs to be efforts made to strengthen the research capacity of the community, so that when the research project is completed, the community has a better capacity to carry on research of its own in future. And as we mentioned before, we need to recognize the role of elders and other knowledge holders in the community. They're the real source of knowledge that needs to go together with the academic knowledge that the community, the university community brings. Next slide. And finally, there's some other important concepts. We need to respect privacy and confidentiality. And communities and their participants need to be involved in the interpretation and dissemination of research results. And certainly the knowledge to action components that should follow meaningful research. We need to have agreements and respect the intellectual property related to research. This includes community ownership rights over research. And finally, the issue of collection of human biological materials is very important. Respect for those materials, making sure that there's proper ceremony in how they're stored and handled and how they're returned to the community when the research is over. Next slide, please. First Nations, Inuit and Métis organizations have also developed ethical principles in health research. What I'm going to talk about in these next few slides is from the First Nation, developed by the Assembly of First Nations and the First Nations Information Governance Council. But the Métis governments and the Inuit organizations have also developed principles of their own. They all share, in a way, two important aspects: ownership of data, ownership of information, and control of that information. So the OCAP principles of the Assembly of First Nations are a standard set of principles establishing how data should be collected, protected, used, or shared. And it asserts that First Nations have control over data collection processes in their communities and that they own and control how this information can be used. It's a de facto standard for how to conduct research with First Nations. And most importantly, it was developed by and for First Nations. Next slide. Ownership refers to the relationship to cultural knowledge, data, and information. A community or group owns information collectively, just as an individual owns his or her personal information. Next slide. Control means the right to community control over all aspects of research and information management. It includes all stages of a research project. It extends to the control of resources and review process, planning, information management, and so on. Next slide. Access means that Indigenous people must have access to information and data about themselves, regardless of where it is held. And it also includes the right to manage and make decisions regarding access to collective information. Next slide. And finally, there's possession, and this refers to physical control of data and the mechanism by which ownership can be asserted and protected. Physical control or physical housing of data or of biological materials does not necessarily have to happen on First Nations territory or in First Nation institutions, but it has to happen with agreement, and stewardship has to be carefully controlled by those agreements. Next slide. Finally, ethical principles in health research have been developed by many of our research institutions. Here I'm quoting from principles developed by the University of Manitoba as a good practice. So they have a framework for a research engagement with First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples. And its objectives is to support the development of research relationships with First Nations, Métis, and Inuit, and to raise awareness of and entrench research processes and practices. Next slide. So those principles are principles of collaboration, that engagement with First Nations, Métis, and Inuit recognizes that this relationship, the engagement, is central to research, and a shared respect, trust, and commitment to mutually empowered long-term relationships. Next slide. We go on, the University of Manitoba goes on in its principles to acknowledge the inherent rights of First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples, the treaty rights of First Nations, and the diversity and distinct identities, histories, cultures, languages, geographies between First Nations, Métis, and Inuit. Next slide, please. These principles emphasize the shared authority, responsibility, and accountability within the research relationships and engagements. And they address the research-related priorities and needs of First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples, and the university. They all need to come together. Next slide. So Indigenous research protocols must be contextualized to local communities. What works and what will be carried out in one community cannot just be duplicated in other communities. You need key considerations and examples such as which communities are being engaged and why. We need research with a purpose. Who are the community guides and interpreters? We've mentioned that they're often the elders or knowledge keepers, but they could also be important people such as community health workers, authorities such as chief or council. How to develop relations with communities. The guidelines and the CIHR guidelines that preceded them give a lot of good examples of how to develop relations with communities. And finally, which practices are appropriate for the community being engaged. And in the next slide, I'll talk about band council resolutions as a possibility. Next slide, please. So what is a band council resolution? And again, this is First Nation specific, but there would be similar things that would come from Inuit or First Nation land claim territories, as well as Métis communities where there's an organized government. It's a resolution, a band council resolution passed by chief and council of a First Nation that's required to initiate, authorize, or approve a transaction or agreement. There are many different band council resolutions passed in First Nations, and we're only going to talk about those that deal with health research agreements in the next slide. So the next slide talks about a band council resolution that relates to health research. It can express support for a research project, hopefully it does. It can formally establish a negotiated research agreement between the First Nation and an external organization, such as a university. This could be attached as an addendum to the band council resolution, and it should include elements of the TriCouncil policy statement, Chapter 9, dealing with research with First Nations. Next slide. So how can a band council resolution serve the purpose of an ethical review? Well, if in consideration in developing the BCR, it assesses whether the proposed research has the potential to benefit the community. This is part of the TriCouncil policy statement. It outlines or should outline conditions for sharing knowledge, again, consistent with TriCouncil policy. It should stipulate the expectations for the community's participation and involvement in the process, and establish ownership and stewardship of biological samples and data, among other things. So if this is all done, next slide, then the research ethics boards in our institutions, at our universities or hospital research foundations, should then have an easy time of approving the research, because the real ethics work has been done at the community level. So this brings me to the end of this first of 3 webinars. And today we looked at the learning objective examining Indigenous worldviews and Indigenous research ethics principles. We'll look forward to continuing with the next 2 segments of this webinar series in the future. So if you turn to the last slide, please, this is an opportunity now for discussion. So there are two ways that you can ask a question. You could raise your hand through the button and wait for the host to call on you, or you could type your question into the chat window. So just before we get to that, though, I would like to make some acknowledgements. I would like to thank my two colleagues in particular at CanSolve CKD, Craig Settee and Graham Pollock, for putting this webinar together with me. And I would sincerely like to thank the Indigenous Peoples Engagement and Research Council of the CanSolve CKD network. It's led by Helen Robinson Settee. And this series is part of our Wabishki Bajikoskanj learning pathway that I'm privileged to be a part of putting together. So, Chimigwech, and let's get on with the discussion.
Hi, it's Craig here again from CanSolve. So one of the questions somebody's asking is just about the dates for the next two webinars. And so we haven't selected the dates yet, but we're planning them for the new year in January and February. So we'll send out some information to people who are registered on the call here, and also on our website, cansolveckd.ca.
It's good, I guess, to have them in the winter. We could think of them as fireside chats.
That's a great idea. And people were also asking about the slide decks. We'll also send out the slide decks to everyone, as well as a survey for this first webinar. So we'd ask you to fill out a survey and give us some feedback on the webinar, and we'll be able to follow up and provide further information for the next two webinars. So it doesn't look like we have any other questions coming in.
I had one, Craig, that was asked of me, and it was along the lines of, what about urban Indigenous people? Because so many of our people do live in our big cities. And I would just like to make the comment that it probably is an advantage to be in an organized First Nation, Inuit, or Métis community, that does have a municipal type or band structure. But any group of Indigenous people who have a common interest can be considered a community. And as communities, they have rights. They should assert those rights of collective ownership of their common information. That doesn't mean that individual rights to information are being overridden. It's just that there are also communal rights. And TriCouncil policy is evolving. And so the latest iteration that came out just last year in 2018 allows for that kind of communal approach amongst groups that aren't even necessarily Indigenous, that there could be other groups where people have a common interest and common purpose. And so let's keep that in mind, and I see this evolving over the coming years.
Fantastic. We did have one other question from a participant, and they ask, so in terms of permission, would a band council be sufficient?
In my view, this is actually being whatever you'd call it, piloted, tested, and they have been accepted, in my experience, by some research ethics boards. I think the important thing is that the Band Council resolution, as I described it in this webinar, really needs to not just authorize the research work that's being planned, but really to examine important aspects of the ethics that would otherwise be examined by an institutional research ethics boards. And I believe that as long as that's part of the Band Council resolution, the questions of ownership, control, access of data, the other aspects of mutual benefits. If these are part of the Band Council resolution, if it's detailed like that, then the Research Ethics Board should not have to re-examine the whole protocol, but to look at the work that the Band Council did in examining it, and then they can subsequently approve it.
Great. Another question that's asked is, are there any existing First Nations ethics review boards in Canada or other areas?
There is the Research Ethics Board at Blue Quills College, which is not strictly speaking on First Nations territory. It's the old residential school at St. Paul, Alberta, where they're located. But the Blue Quills College is owned by a number of First Nations in eastern Alberta. I think there may be 9 First Nations that participate in Blue Quills. So, and that's an interesting place because their research protocols begin with ceremony. Normally a pipe ceremony. I've actually gone there and taken part in a pipe ceremony as part of their ethics process. But they also consider really thoroughly the important questions that are there in the TriCouncil policy statement as well.
I'm just going to unmute a participant to ask a question. Can you unmute her? I can't unmute her. She's unmuted.
Thanks, Craig. It's Selena. I have a question for Malcolm. I really enjoyed the presentation, and I think there's some really good reminders for all researchers. The question I have for you, Malcolm, is are you able to share a publication or a resource where there's a good example of how researchers have engaged with Indigenous communities, ideally, obviously in Canada, but maybe something internationally, and just to get a sense of, how the research team worked with Indigenous communities?
Yes, I can. Not right off the top of my head, but I will put together 2 or 3 links to such questions. I think there are quite a number of good examples, and I'll work with Craig and Graham to send that material out along with the webinar information to everyone. great question. Thank you.
Thanks.
And another question that is being asked is, you spoke about the importance of ceremony in research. How would you recommend introducing that to the Western researchers who are just beginning their work with Indigenous communities?
It's not easy because a lot of Western researchers don't see the idea of ceremony as being something that's intricately linked with research or other parts of life. They see ceremony as separate. And yet, I think in most Indigenous worldviews, ceremony is part of life. So to me, the best way is to begin by sharing ceremonies, sharing circles, if you like, or other formats with community and academic people. I've actually been taking part in one of those earlier today. And it can start in a modest way, you know, with prayer, with smudging, but ultimately the researchers need to go to the community and take part in the ceremonies that the community people use themselves, such as sweat lodge, pipe ceremonies, and so on. It does require effort on the part of the researcher to try and engage, to try and understand and respect the Indigenous worldviews and ways of doing.
That's fantastic. I think too, I've also been asked this question a bit, and one thought that I've had is also to connect with student groups, and especially Indigenous student groups in institutions for maybe new researchers. That's one thought that I've had.
Very good perspective from someone who was a recent student. Thank you, Craig.
Yeah, so I'll move on. There's another question here that is related to the Band Council resolution again, and it's for national, provincial research initiatives, what would be the Band Council resolution equivalent?
That's a good question, but we do have regional or provincial organizations in First Nations, Métis, there's Inuit groups. And although they're not the sovereign entities, they're, I think the term might be advocacy organizations. They can still put together the type of resolution and ethical review. They could do this. And if the research that's being done is done not at an individual community level, but at the regional level, I think that would be an appropriate group. And I think our research ethics boards would recognize that it's a different level, and it would be an appropriate thing, say, to have a provincial First Nations or Métis organization examine the research.
Great. So it doesn't look like there's any other questions on the board at this time. So maybe we will wrap up the webinar for now, and just like to say for people on the call, please spread the word as well to your networks, and hopefully we'll have some more folks on the second and third webinars. And I would also like to give a big miigwech thank you to Dr. Malcolm King for giving us some of his time and sharing his wisdom with us on this webinar.
Miigwech.
And we'll send out the surveys and follow up with folks. And if you have any other questions, please include them in your surveys as well, that we can look for inclusion in the next two webinars. So with that, I'll say thank you and hope everyone has a nice rest of their day.
Bye.